Good afternoon on the East Coast, and welcome to B2W's 30-Minute Expert Series. This week, we'd like to cover the practical steps for making your next technology rollout a success. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Doug Seiler, the Senior Business Analyst with B2W, and with me here I have Ian Cannon, who's a Business Analyst and our Implementation Manager. Ian will be addressing questions that you folks may have throughout the webinar, and he will, if at the end, if time allows, we can address any other questions that may not have been answered throughout the process. We're going to keep this fairly high level, just outlining the practical steps that will help you in rolling out any given system, not just ours, but I'll outline our implementation process as well, which we'll be able to provide you with additional details should you want more information on that as to how we go through the process outside of just your responsibility in the process as well. So I'd like to, in the requirements for really making a successful rollout of technologies, it starts with a clear corporate mandate. And I'll go through each of these steps throughout the process. The next piece is really having an empowered team to drive the implementation process at your own company, and then defining the implementation roadmap based on your desired outcomes and expectations. And then at the end, I'll cover acknowledgement of the common mistakes that companies can make that sidetrack the implementation or delay employee buy-in. So in starting out, one of the struggles we see companies, we talk about having a corporate mandate, and sometimes it can be taken negatively, positively. We always talk about having buy-in at the executive level, and sometimes that works. It always works well, but sometimes it doesn't quite trickle down to the individuals who are directly involved in the project once it gets going. Sometimes they feel as though they're having new technology or a new process pushed on them, which often is resented, and as a vendor or an implementer, we tend to bump up against that often where a company hasn't quite prepared on their end with communicating the impacts of an implementation or a new technology out to the troops. So one of the things that's very important is that communication up front within an organization, that everybody who's going to be impacted understands what's coming, defining what the expectations are, and within the communication, understanding what's going to change, what you're expecting to get out of the system, so that people can understand if they're going to be impacted by the change in technology. The other piece that's important as well within a corporate mandate is to share the benefits and what's expected results of implementing a new system. Often it could be somebody who's just entering or keying data in. They may think it's just a mundane process, but they need to understand where that information goes and the importance of their role in the entire process. Often that's overlooked, and someone just feels like they're being asked to do more without ever really understanding how that information is being used. So the other is including key individuals. We tend to overlook individuals that need to be involved in the process, and just looking at possibly, we see a lot of people just involve the IT team, where you really need to bring in other experts throughout the organization to have a key role in the process. And then the other part is really clarifying and outlining time commitments. A lot of people do feel as though it's going to take more time than it really does out of their pocket. They have their regular day jobs, but they need to understand, it needs to be communicated within the organization that it's going to impact you, but the outcome is beneficial. And that's one thing where I think there's more fear as to how much it's going to intrude on people's days than how it really does impact them. So the next piece is really when you're picking your team, having an empowered team that has the right mix of people. You want the people that can make decisions. You want somebody that's leading the team that understands the process, understands the industry best practice that you need to develop this system to solve. So really understanding your business, not, as I said before, not just in IT people. Some people that are in IT are very operationally oriented, but you really need the operational people involved in the entire process. And you need people that have the access to the data to build your database. We run into a lot of situations where the project leads have to go to 3 to 4 people in layers back in your organization to get the data that's necessary to build the databases. And that tends to slow down the process and kind of detach the people from the process. So in the end of that, you really want to have people involved in the process that are respected by the end users. You may choose somebody that really knows the business, that's a hard driver, but are they really the person to best relay a new system out to the end users? You want to make it acceptable on their end. So when it comes to the implementation roadmap, this is where we look at this as we break our process into 6 pieces: the project initiation, define and design, develop and configure, training and go live prep, the actual go live period, and then a handoff to success management. But there's a key component that leads into this. It's really the pre-implementation plan on your end, on a business end, which is really understanding your needs before it even reaches our involvement. So this is at the pre-implementation level. This is where you need, as I pointed out, you need to define your resource needs within the company and the commitments that these individuals will have to the project. You don't want that to be a surprise once they start dealing with the vendor or dealing with us. When we start asking them for things and they haven't had the communication from the organization telling them that they're going to have to have this commitment, it's sometimes received negatively when we're asking for things that they're not aware that they're going to be involved in. So the other piece is it's just a clear communication within the organization, understanding why you've bought this product, understanding what you're going to get out of it, as I mentioned earlier. But then another really big piece is take the opportunity to look at your internal processes before we even get to discussions with us on the implementation end. So understand your processes, understand differences within the organization and where you may have variances from one department to another. Often during the sales process, only certain individuals are exposed to that. They may be individuals from one department thinking everyone across the organization does things the same. And often when it comes to the implementation process, we're starting to build something based on what came out of the sales process. Then we find out as we involve other individuals from the company that it really isn't how the company operates. So really it helps to understand your own business process prior to stepping into the implementation process with us. And also having common desired outcomes, understanding across the organization, what are we solving? What's the problem? What do we want to get out of this system when we're done? And if you start to review those prior to the implementation, then we're not spending the entire implementation time helping guide you to determine what am I here for? What do I want to get out of the system? We will spend a considerable amount of time with you on that, but having that defined and common across the organization helps. Sometimes we'll see where the desired outcomes are defined by certain people in the sales process. Then we get into the implementation process, and the individuals involved there are really looking to get something completely different out of the system. So that does create some confusion. So in really understanding, and this ties into understanding your internal business process, is who's going to be impacted by the changes that a system brings to the company, and communicating those potential impacts prior to that happening. So in the pre-implementation, that's a critical step for when we enter the picture in the implementation process itself. And what you'll see here, this is very high level, But what you'll see here is we'll focus on the business requirements, the expectations, desired outcome, and really defining a customer profile and defining what are you here for? What do you want to get out of the system? There's plenty it's not just building a database, walking away and saying, here's your database. We want to really build it to what your specific needs are. And in this first phase, this is where you're really defining your scope of work, your communication plan, who takes on what role in the implementation process, and then setting milestones and key dates and deliverables. But as I highlight here, a really big focus is on you as a company and understanding where you're going to go with the product and what's different about you from another company. So in the next stage of define and design is where we start to talk to you about these business processes that you've established prior to coming into the implementation process. So we start to understand what do you do? How are you going to use the system in detail and configure the system and design it to meet your future state needs? So it's as I said, it's not just building a database. It's really, you need to understand yourself as a business. We want to understand you as a business so that everything is configured to meet your needs. So I'll just back up on that. Another piece that's very critical is understanding the system at a high level while you're building your database. To just build a database without visualizing how a system works and how you're going to apply it really kind of gives you, it doesn't give you a full picture of how you're going to use the system in the end. So the next phase that we look at is to develop and configure. And this is where we get into the nuts and bolts of configuring a system to meet your needs, whether it's the column order, whether it's the descriptions used that are common to your people in the field, so that it isn't completely foreign to everybody. So at the same time, this is where we do some integration testing, confirm and validate that the data in your database is what you're looking for. And then it's beginning to establish a training plan based on what you expect to get out of the system. And this is where it goes back to your predetermined goals. What do you want to get out of it so that we're not chasing every element of the system and showing you things that you really don't need to see. And this is where we're truly establishing your future state. So as we get into the training and go live prep, this is a period where your trainers come in, and as again, based on the phase one of the implementation process, this is where we're conducting training based on what you said you need and what you want to get out of the system. So without defining that up front, you can't target the training to get the most out of the training process to really focus on what makes your business work. And this is the period where we're validating the final solution, reviewing your business processes, and then updating the database as needed. Sometimes you don't know everything that you need until you get into training and understanding the system. So we have the ability to verify and modify the configurations. So the next step is really what we look at as the critical part of the process. Is once you're live, that's when you've got to take the piece and the system and move it forward. And in a lot of processes we've seen where with other systems and other companies, I came from the business in the contracting side, and I've seen it where products get implemented and the vendor and the implementation is done once you're trained. What we do is we see this as a critical point where we keep your implementer with you to make sure that everything's operating right in your production environment. And if there's additional detailed training needed, that you get that additional training needed after your overall training. And then confirm that the desired outcomes are met and that people are actually using the product. So you're not just left out in the cold saying, hey, now that I've been trained, how do I use this? Where do I go? And that's a critical piece of any rollout, is keeping your people involved with whoever is on the vendor side and constant feedback of, what are we struggling with? Because if you don't keep that communication going, you're apt to have users just stop using the system and step away from it. So this is really the critical point of the entire process. But at this point as well, this could take anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. It depends on how well your people adapt to the system. So at that point is where we look at is preparing for an additional handoff, following that to a success team. And this is where I look at this as a long-term care coverage. It's almost like an insurance policy where this is where somebody works with you to optimize your use of the system. Often you don't know exactly how deep you need to go into using a system until you use it. So once you're into it, then you find out that there's other things you can do in the system. So this is very critical as well, is making sure that you know that there's other parts of the system that you can utilize once you get comfortable with what you've originally implemented. So at each of these stages, what's really important is to have gate check reviews. And that's where you've got to bring in the key primary stakeholders and discuss any risks, any issues that may be coming up that may put your project at risk. What's making things fall behind? What are some struggles you're having with adoption? What's changed in the process that may complicate the project and change the scope? So this is very critical to have these reviews and have the right people involved in this, not just the folks that are involved in the day-to-day implementation, but bring the primary stakeholders back in to discuss what may be happening that's different than what their expectation was up front. Because in the end, you want this you want it to be accepted all the way back to where it began. So some of the common mistakes we run into, and you think it would be simple, but a lot of companies in the middle of the process will change who's the project manager on the company side. We keep the same person all the way through the implementation process. But a lot of times they end up, from week to week, end up dealing with a different person. And that can really derail the process. So you really need to think about who's the key person that needs to be involved in the implementation up front. And often one of the problems we run into is the person who manages the implementation was never involved in the sales process. So they weren't aware of what was discussed up to that point. So it's very key, even if they're not involved with working with a salesperson on the vendor side, have them involved in the demos. Even if you're not sure who it may be, include a few people in that so they know what's coming down the road. So one of the other pieces we see, and this goes back to understanding your own processes. Quite often we see customers that they think the solution is going to fix a broken process. And that's where we encourage you to understand your process so that when we start to look at the solution, we can determine what needs to be tweaked on which end. And a lot of people do approach a software system thinking that's going to fix something that's broken. And that usually isn't the case. One of the other common mistakes we see is people they end up repeating the past. They get comfortable with how they did things previously, and then when they implement software, they just put the same thing in place. And that's something you really want to look at and going, as I said, looking back at your processes. What are we doing that we seem to be tripping over ourselves? What can we streamline that we can utilize the system to make work easier? And that's it. It's a real easy. It's easy to fall back in your comfort zone and just do what you've always done, but just in a different platform. I really encourage people to really evaluate your process prior to the implementation so that you can be aware of what may need to be changed. So again, as I mentioned early on, is undefined desired outcomes. And if you don't know what you want out of a system, how do you measure whether it's successful, whether people are using it as a tool, whether it's producing the correct information to send to your accounting system. So you've got to determine what did we send into this system for, and this is your measurable point all the way through the process. So one of the other stumbling blocks we see, and I mentioned this earlier as well, is people have the impression that a system is very heavily IT focused, where I'll speak to our systems, the actual IT involvement is very, very minimal. It's very critical to have an operational person involved in it. A lot of companies do have IT people that are very operationally oriented, but the IT requirement is the minimal requirement. The configuration and designing the layout of a system and the database needs are really to meet an operational need. So we also, one of the things that I see customers struggle with, and I hear it all the time, is they underestimate the end users. You hear the statement of my guys will never be able to do that. We find that really isn't the case if your system is configured correctly, and if you've sold the product internally to the employees and they understand what their commitment is, what the complications that they may face. But really, as they pick up a field employee picks up an iPad or mobile, any other mobile device, you'd be surprised how easily they adapt to it. And it's discouraging to hear companies underestimate what the end users are really capable of. So the other piece is not sharing the impacts with individuals that are going to be involved in the process. Sure, it's not all positive. It's not always going to be, simplifying a process for them. Sometimes it may complicate, but the end result can be better. If you're getting data out of it to better manage, yes, sometimes it's a little more work, but you've got to show the positive net result. And going back to not setting expectations, there's no measurement of what is a successful implementation. And that goes back to defining what are we getting out of the system when we're done. Another issue that we see quite common is people, they see a solution and they see all the things they can do with it. And maybe it's more things than they've ever presented to their people in the field. Well, you don't want to overcomplicate the solution right out of the gate, because end users will push back. And I see people kind of have the desire, we're going to collect this just because we can. So you really have to think about that and make sure you're not overcomplicating the solution right out of the gate, because it does sometimes generate pushback. So the keys to making it successful, and this is kind of the standard, but upper management buy-in. But that really needs to be passed down throughout the organization, not just speaking to it and saying, oh, our upper management is really pushing this. But if they're pushing it and no one else has been brought on board, that can really kick back on you. But you've got to have the upper management buy-in along with the other levels of the organization. And in choosing the correct project lead, and going back to, and I'm not bashing on IT guys, but sometimes we have companies that think the IT person is the one that needs to run the project. And in most cases, it really is an operational person. So, and the keys is defining your processes and having the clear desired outcomes, and then build excitement around the knowledge, build excitement around what people are going to get out of the system. If people are just putting data in and not knowing where it's going, not seeing something come back to them for their efforts, and it can be discouraging. So you want to have, if it's as simple as just a productivity feedback, that means something to people. So if they see that they're doing something and getting something back out of it, and then having realistic expectations. Not if you don't feel your organization can take on everything at once, take on the bare necessities, and then have a plan to build a deeper rollout. So it's very important to keep that realistic, because as I said, you can look at it and think, look at all these new things I can do, but if it requires much more work above and beyond what people have been used to, you just have to find that balance. So if there's any other questions I'm not sure how many have been sent in to Ian here. If there's an interest in any further detail on this, feel free to reach out to us, because this really just brushes the surface of how we approach this. And really, it comes down to you as a company, and as much information as you can feed us about yourselves helps really to build a better process and build a better system for you. So the next webinar that we do have coming up is Save Time with Real-Time Alerts and Notifications with B2W Inform. And that's very helpful. If you're not familiar with that product, it's a really it's a great flexible tool for building forms and tracking the data within the forms. So it's very BI oriented, and I think if people see that, they'll really get a lot out of it. So if you need more information, feel free to reach out to our sales department, and feel free to reach out to our support department, and they'll put you in touch with us where we can lead you through our process very, very specifically and how it would fit your company. And just keep in mind, anybody who is on this, we will email you a link to the recorded session. So appreciate everybody staying with us through this process, and feel free to reach out. Thank you.